It is time, folks, to talk Ohio State football. So we love doing that with Claire Crawford. You can join her on theozone.net. Her podcast with Joe Dexter is
Oh,
Oh,
Hate I
Hail
Know.
No. It's just the best name in podcast history. It's just the best. Claire, it's been a while. How you've been?
It has been a while. I'm starting to get itchy. I'm like I need a fix for Ohio State football. I'm like counting down the days until the spring game. Not only because it's going to be the spring game, but because I cannot take the white death that is upon us any longer. I just want it to be spring.
Yeah, so there's a lot of good things there to look forward to. Yes, blue skies, spring
Yep.
weather. We had one day of it, and I savored it yesterday, and now we're covered with snow.
Yep.
As expected. That's fine. We know what the deal is. But yeah, it's nice for Christmas. At least this is my perspective. I would take it for about a week during Christmas, get me through New Year's, and then, hey, I'm ready. I'm done.
I'm good.
Good to
Yep.
go. So
Same
it's
here.
been a while. Yeah, it's been a long time since we've had you on, since National Signing Day when I crashed
Yeah.
your party with Mike McDaniel.
I'm
So
still celebrating.
yeah, it was quite the load of talent moving its way to Columbus. But we're going to go back in time. This is the time we can do this. Ever since we started having these weekly conversations, it's been football season for the most part, or recruiting season. So there have been heavy hitting news to talk about. Now we can throw around some fun subjects. And this is one I love. I was telling Claire before we started record what a nerd I am for lists. I always have to tell people this is the top 10 or this is the top 5 of this. These are my 10 favorite songs, anything, but especially sports, of course. And so Claire, as a ardent Ohio State football fan, I would love to know for you, because it's not always the obvious, because people have different reasons to answer this question in different ways. Your favorite wins of all time, those wins that maybe it wasn't necessarily a championship situation or an obvious answer, maybe just something unique about a particular game, but whether it's one, whether it's three, whether it's five, whatever your list of most the wins that you embrace the most.
So these are great lists to make. I'm also a complete list nerd and all time type of list nerd. Um, the first one that comes to mind without really too much thought going into it, and it may seem like low hanging fruit, but I think everybody's lists are different because everybody's sample size is different and everybody attaches special memories to certain things. So the 2002 national championship season and the 2002, well, first of all, the Purdue game has to be cemented in your memory in that season. Several games should be cemented in that memory, but the Purdue game is probably, other than that national championship game, the biggest indicator of the guts on that team and the incredible talent that came out of that team. In 2002, my daughter was born, and it was just such a magical time in my life. And I will never forget during the game. First of all, going into that game, no one gave Ohio State a chance. No one in the media, no one expected Ohio State to have a chance against Miami. I mean,
I'm in the media.
you were in the media. I'm guessing you gave Ohio State a chance,
A
though.
little bit of a chance.
And I was nervous. I was sweating it the whole time. And you know, seeing Maurice Claret just completely gut out. He had his his bloody sock moment where he was just banged up and bruised and just kept fighting throughout that game. He was pretty banged up that entire season. The guy carried a lot on his back. Uh, no hyperbole there all season. No matter what you think about him, he had a huge contribution to that season and that game, specifically that strip that we can all remember where he stripped the ball back. I think we remember guys like Willis McGahee and some of the horrific injuries that happened during that game, the back and forth on what's pass interference and what's not pass interference. But I remember we had purchased our first home, and it was this teeny tiny, I mean, like Cracker Box type of, just a tiny little house. And my daughter was just a couple months old, and we were all kind of huddled around the TV in this tiny little house. And in overtime, when the Buckeyes sealed the win with the interception, we jumped so high and so loud that our knuckles scraped the ceiling in this tiny little house. We were so excited. It was just a really cool moment. And I just felt like my kiddo was destined. She had something to do with it somehow.
So bless her heart for winning a national championship for Ohio State for the first time in 34 years at the time. So this is what I remember from that game in terms of the actual action on the field, besides all the obvious things, the pass interference at the end, which I claim, I understand Miami fans are upset about it and would continue to be upset, and I would be upset if I was in their position. I get it, but I think a distinction can be made here. Actually, the proper call on the play would have been holding, which would have had basically the same result. Because if you watch the play, Gamble comes off the line, the defensive back grabs him and holds him. And then the ball comes and Gamble blows the catch and there's hit in there together. And I think it was a clean play in terms of the portion where the ball was in the air and was broken up. But prior to that, the defensive back is holding him. He's got both hands on his jerseys and he's holding him. So that would have converted the fourth down anyway and put them at the 2 or 3 yard line. So the result would have been, so that's my claim as a nerd that says I'm going to be nitpicky and tell you exactly what happened because that's what happened. This is what, Claire, most people don't remember about this game is the previous possession. Actually, the final Ohio State possession of regulation, the Buckeyes led 17-14. They had the ball, and there was about 2.5 minutes left in the game. They threw an out to Chris Gamble again. There was no replay at the time. He caught the ball inbounds, and he was also held. The defensive back had his jersey as he came out of his cut. Krenzel threw him the ball. He caught it. It would have been a first down. He caught a first down. And I remember Keith Jackson saying, let's look at that replay again. He caught that ball. Gets a foot in. He catches the ball. They call it incomplete. Plus, he's held. It's pass interference.
Right. Either way.
So Ohio State would have hung on to the ball. Now, we don't know if they would have kept it long enough to kill the entire clock, but they certainly would have had the chance to. And if anything, they would have kicked it away with a lot less time on the clock, like next to nothing. They would have had 4 more downs to squeeze the clock and then punt it away. Well, what happened was they had a punt then. The Miami returner, forget who it was, possibly Roscoe Parrish, brings it back to field goal range, and they tie and go to overtime. So Miami fans that get all uptight about the way the game ended, I remind them of a few things that if you'd watch the game start to finish, that are less infamous than the final play. And then actually, if Miami did have the opportunity, so Ohio State scores the touchdown after the Gamble interference call.
Right.
And
Ken Dorsey.
At that point, well, actually, Ohio State had to still win 3 consecutive possessions because that touchdown tied the game. Then they had to score another touchdown to take the lead. Then they had to stop Miami on defense. So Ohio State won 3 straight possessions to win that game. Otherwise, Miami still had opportunities to win the game. The other thing I remember, Claire, is that at work, we had a college football bowl pool, and I was like buried. I'm like in 13th place or something like that. But it had elevated point totals as the games became more important. And all 12 people ahead of me picked Miami to win. So I went to the top and won like $500.
Oh my gosh.
And then
super lucky.
The other thing I remember is that it being early January, I live in Connecticut, and the power goes out like
Oh,
Friday afternoon. And you know that that happens in maybe once every 5 years
right.
and you don't know how long it's going to last. And I'm like thinking of all sorts of alternate plans, got to load up the kids and the whole family in a car and drive to a hotel somewhere, whatever I need to do. But fortunately, we got the power back and the TV back on to watch the game.
Good.
Then my last unique, I have tons of memories of the game, but they're the same memories that everybody else has. But the other unique memory would be I'm up the rest of the night, as I typically am,
Of course.
like every night. I was going to say during college football championship games, but no, this is pretty much every
No.
night. That I'm up on the phone, I'm talking to friends and that sort of thing, and I'm watching the ESPN bottom line scroll, and it has listed the wrong date, the wrong year of Ohio State's previous national championship game. It says Ohio State wins first national championship since, it said like 1928 instead of
What?
68.
68, yeah.
So I saw this scroll, I don't know how many times before I finally picked up the
Called
phone, called work, and said, you need to get somebody on that bottom line. We're
Some PA is going to lose their job.
absolutely. Bottom line productions. That's who it is. But anyway,
Right.
so that's a win. You can chime in with anything else, but that would be the winning side. We'll get you on the downside now, the excruciating losses.
So not too far away from that 2002 win. I want to say I'm only judging this on how I felt after the game and the days and weeks after the game. 2006 felt like a gut punch, and it probably it didn't even feel it. I'll say it felt a lot like Clemson. It was I had that sinking feeling that I think a lot of Ohio State fans had when Ted Ginn Jr. went down after he scored that touchdown, was hurt in the celebration of all things. And Troy Smith, remember him in warm-ups looking like he had a few In-N-Out burgers. And I just didn't feel good from the start. And of course, we know what Urban Meyer managed to accomplish in that game. But I remember not being able to turn the television on. Luckily, social media was not very big or even born yet. I think maybe MySpace was. Otherwise, I would not have been able to go on social media as well. I couldn't talk to my friends about it. I was emotionally distraught. And then the basketball team goes and does the same thing to the same school. And it brought all of those memories back again. But that has to be pretty close to one of the most devastating losses. And again, I think part of how I measure that is how I feel. And part of it is the potential of a team that could have won that game on talent alone, much like that 2015 team.
So at that point, taking people back close to 12 years, the SEC had not established itself as the best conference. There was an argument, and the SEC was in the argument, but the SEC did not dominate the argument at the time. The Big Ten was certainly respected as possibly the best conference in college football. Actually, the Big 12 had some cachet with Texas and Oklahoma. What's that?
I was agreeing. Yeah, Big 12. And even, yeah, I'll agree with that.
USC had just won a national championship, but 2 years prior, actually 03 and 04, depending on your poll, and then had the big game against Texas and Vince Young. They were the big favorite, but lost. So they could have won 3 straight national championships. So there was this huge balance to college football at the time in terms of the blue bloods across the nation being equal in different conferences. And yes, the SEC played great football, produced tons of talent, but it wasn't like in lockdown mode as it was. That game almost marked a spot in college football
Beginning of an
history.
era.
Yes, because Ohio State marched into that game consensus number one.
Yeah.
Everybody's number one in every poll, every vote. Heisman Trophy winner, best team, full touchdown favorite. They are the best team in the country. Some people didn't even believe that Florida should have been in the game. Thought, we want to see Ohio State, Michigan play. They're the two best teams in the country. Let's see them play again. And then Florida lays Ohio State to waste, and the narrative then completely changed.
And I think you're right about the beginning of an era. It seemed like, you're right, there were teams in the SEC that were becoming dominant, but I think there was a bigger disparity, and that you're right. And I never really thought about it that way, but that marked the beginning of a really important era and a trajectory for Urban Meyer.
Yeah, the Big Ten and the SEC, actually, that bowl season, the Big Ten won 2 earlier games, which led me to believe, okay, Ohio State's performance is being justified, and this is a good indicator for this game. Boy, I usually remember all the bowl games, but I believe it was Arkansas, Wisconsin beat Arkansas, and Penn State beat Tennessee. And those were very comparable games in terms of looking at second and third and fourth place teams and lining them up to say, okay, well, the Big Ten won these 2 games. And now Ohio State, the best team in the Big Ten, is going to play Florida, the best team in the SEC. And if anything, Ohio State is definitely the best team in the Big Ten, probably the best team in the country. In Florida, well, they just kind of eked out the SEC. So there's justification for Ohio State being that solid of a favorite. And then after that, boy, it didn't matter what the Big Ten did or the SEC did in other games. It was all about the championship. Ohio State blew it. The Big Ten's awful. And then it was backed up by the LSU game against the Buckeyes in New Orleans the next season.
That was bad too. That is one of those times where you will rarely hear me say Ohio State did not deserve to be in that game. They should. I remember thinking the whole time that there is not a chance that you obviously know I'm a huge Ohio State fan. There was this part of me this much that was like, I almost don't want them to be here because I don't want to see this happen. And it unfortunately happened that way.
All right, Claire. So those are the wins and losses. And I think a lot of Buckeye fans would jump on your list and be right there with you, especially considering,
Michigan
modern.
State, 96. That's a tough one. Clemson.
Yeah. So a lot of people would go. Yeah, a lot of people would go to the John Cooper era because John Cooper has a fascinating run at Ohio State. So for Buckeye fans, it's not fascinating. But to me, trying to be an unbiased college football observer, it's fascinating from the standpoint, if you tack 2 or 3 wins onto John Cooper's resume at Ohio State, the narrative completely changes. He's got a completely different career.
I would say those wins would have to be bowl wins in order for that to be the case.
Or Michigan games.
Or Michigan games. Exactly.
So in 93, 95, 96. So there's 3 seasons right there in the span of 4 years. They're undefeated playing Michigan and they lose. And they're playing for a national title if they beat Michigan. But they didn't. And you referenced the Nick Saban Michigan State team that beat Ohio State in 98. That then, of course, since they had the loss and were kind of knocked out of it, of course, they complete the run and beat Michigan and win the Rose Bowl, but they had lost earlier. So that's why John Cooper, his record is not bad. And he had about 4 or 5 exceptional teams that were as good as anyone in the country, but he lost the wrong games.
And I think a lot of people point to John Cooper and say, oh, he was a great recruiter of talent, which you can't deny that. You know, you see the guys that, Orlando Pace and Eddie George, the guys that we can point to, David Boston. That list is very, very long. And even some people will argue that Trestle's 2002 team would have been partially John Cooper's recruits as well. So, I mean, it's you can't deny that about him. And I think the the John Cooper apologists will use that as their brandishing stick to say this is, but he did do this. Ultimately, when it comes down to Ohio State, there are a few things that count the most, and beating Michigan is on the top of that list.
Yeah, for John Cooper, the crescendo was winning the Rose Bowl over Arizona State, coming back to win that game, finishing 11-1, and
Jake
then I'm sorry,
it wasn't Jake the Snake, right?
Jake the Snake, who thought he scored the game-winning touchdown, but of course, David Boston and Joe Germain had other ideas.
Gosh.
And then 2 years later, they beat Michigan and beat Texas A&M, a top 5 team that won the Big 12 in the Sugar Bowl, and they finished number 2 again. So that was 2 number 2 finishes in the span of 3 years for John Cooper. What might have been.
And that would have been pre-BCS, right?
So I've got a story for you. 1998, I'm at the Georgia Dome for the SEC championship game, covering the SEC championship game, Tennessee and Mississippi State. Tennessee's number 1. During the course of that day, Ohio State was like number 5, number 6, something like that in the nation. And there were just a line of one-loss teams, and Tennessee was the one undefeated team. So during the course of the day, I'm sorry, what?
Was that Peyton's senior year, or was he 96?
No, he was gone. So it was T. Martin.
Okay. T. Martin.
And that's the interesting oddity to Tennessee football, is that Peyton Manning's the golden child and won the Heisman, or he almost won the Heisman, lost the Heisman to Charles Woodson. Everybody thought he was going to win the Heisman. And then, of course, he becomes one of the great NFL quarterbacks in history. But he left Tennessee, and then they won the national championship the next year. But I'm at the Georgia Dome earlier in the day. So this is the last game of the day. Earlier in the day, UCLA was in front of Ohio State. They lost. Kansas State was in front of Ohio State. They lost the Big 12 championship game. And one other shoe had to fall, and that had to be Tennessee. And Tennessee was down in the fourth quarter of the SEC championship game to Mississippi State, but they came back and they won the game with 2 touchdowns in the last 10 minutes of the game. And Ohio State then went to the Sugar Bowl. And so it was a BCS championship game between Tennessee and Florida State, the very first one.
And you could also say that was, ironically, the end of an era for Tennessee.
Absolutely.
I mean, literally a screeching halt after that national championship. And I don't know if you want to say those two things coincide, that the SEC started to become more powerful and over the next 10 years started to really dominate, and the parity in the SEC started cannibalizing these other teams. But Tennessee still hasn't recovered from that.
Not very much. They've had a few glimpses, and that's about it.
They've been close.
We got Claire Crawford on the line talking Ohio State football. Join her and Joe Dexter for Oh Hail No. That's their podcast you can find on theozone.net. We got our wins. We got our losses. Who's coaching your team for Ohio State? Who's the guy?
So this is a tough one. And if you're an Ohio State fan, you'll know who Jack Park is. And Jack Park is an Ohio State historian. For those of you who aren't Ohio State fans, and he is one of my favorite people walking this planet. I'm debating on whether to go with the really easy pick or if I go with a Jack Park pick. I'm
asking for a Claire Crawford pick.
I know. I'm honestly tempted. Well, it's difficult because if we're coaching a modern football team, I wouldn't necessarily pick a Wes Fessler, but I'm also tempted to pick a really old school Wes Fessler who created lots of amazing traditions at Ohio State, was an extremely winning coach as far as his percentages, but obviously is not necessarily going to be able to coach like the forward pass.
So I take this as your favorite coach. This doesn't have to be the best coach. Your favorite.
Well, you got to go with Woody, and not taking anything away from Urban. I think Woody Hayes and knowing what he did for the community. There's a story that I love about Woody Hayes, and I know you have a lot of Clemson fans on here, so they're just going to absolutely murder me for mentioning Woody Hayes, but there's a good reason. Woody used to go to speaking engagements, and they would pay him to do so. And it was still in the days of someone writing you a check for it, and he would put them in his pocket and never cash them. And his wife Anne would find these checks, and she knew better than to even take them to the bank. Is that he wouldn't want her to do that. The things that he did for his players, very quietly, the community that he built, the traditions that he built at Ohio State, his passion for the rivalry is something that is probably going to make him jump above all other coaches in my mind. I obviously am a huge fan of the game, and no one is going to be able to convince me otherwise that isn't the greatest rivalry in sports. And Woody and Bo and the 10-year war, there still isn't anything that compares to that. And Woody went out of his way to do things. And you and I have talked about the rug that they used to have to walk over every single day as a reminder. Woody Hayes wouldn't, they ran out of gas in Michigan and had to roll the car the bus across state lines because he refused to pay, give any taxes to that state up north. He had a lot of respect for Bo. They were very good friends. They obviously used to coach together at Ohio State. Him being from Miami, saying that's the cradle of coaches. So many amazing coaches came from that area. And he is the cream of the crop. So he was passionate, and yes, he had a temper that ultimately ended his career. But I definitely think that Woody was meant to be born in the era he was born in. And we're thankful he was.
A truer statement has never been uttered. Yes, Woody Hayes in 2018 would have been that would have been a train wreck, but it would have been just priceless.
Violation after violation after violation, I'm sure.
Yeah, in 2018, I think we need to put those days into context, understanding that these children grew up at a different time in our history, whether it's Woody Hayes, Bo Schembechler, Bobby Knight, those guys, when it came down to it and their players would vouch for them, those guys had a heart of gold.
Yes.
And would do anything for charity, would do anything for their teammates, and then later their players. And the stories, when it comes down to it, and their actions spoke louder than maybe their actions on a field or a court, of how they conducted themselves and the character that they had. Yes, they grew up at a different time. So grabbing players by face masks or shoving guys around or doing whatever they had to do, they were men's men, and that's how they grew up.
And you can't deny his resume at Ohio State and how many national championships he was able to bring. And obviously, lots and lots is named after him at Ohio State. There's a very big statue right outside the Woody Hayes where Urban Meyer and his teams work out and practice and play every day. And there's definitely a reason for it.
Claire, for a school that's produced, and the numbers change, of course, each and every year, but right up in the top 2 or 3 for All-Americans and first-round NFL draft picks and Pro Football Hall of Famers and whatever category you want to place. Heisman Trophy winners, of course, as well. Who would be your favorite player in the history of Ohio State football? I do not have a guess at this one.
It is for similar reasons as similar reasons I'm going to justify why this is my favorite Ohio State player of all time. So there are so many that I could name, and I'm sure I am going to screw this up.
You can't screw it up.
This is, well, right. Exactly right. I mean, I'm sure if I picked maybe, I don't know, there maybe a few I would pick. If I said Terrell Pryor, people would be like, what?
That's my son's favorite player.
Oh my gosh. Joe Belgerman, maybe. I don't know, Justin Swick. Those would be maybe not great choices. I am going to go with a very vanilla choice, but I think it's safe. And I think he cannot be usurped, in my opinion, barring some horrible dramatic incident, and that's Archie Griffin. And part of it is that he's a Columbus guy. I'm a Columbus native. I love my city. I love my state. Archie's not a big guy, but he certainly has got incredible heart and work ethic. And I think what he was able to do with Woody and in combination, those two in concert, again, were meant to be on that team together. And I don't think it gets covered a whole lot, what Archie had to go through, even in the 70s, what he had to go through as far as the racial tensions and some of that stuff that was still going on. Woody did a great job of attempting to squash a lot of it, but Archie still had to go through some of that and has come out one of the most positive, uplifting, magical people. The fact that he still is the only player to have 2 Heisman trophies. I love this story about Archie where he was so excited to get on the field for the very first time that he forgot his helmet and had to come running back over to the sidelines and put his helmet on. So what Archie's been able to do as an alumnus and as someone who loves Ohio State and Columbus and the state of Ohio to his core, he is such an incredible class act. And again, you can't really, Archie was meant to play on that team during that era. He was able, and Ray for that matter, he was able to do something that we had never seen before. And I think he even kind of paved the way. He was a pioneer for what running backs were going to look like in the future at Ohio State.
Okay. What I'm about to say may be a bit sacrilegious.
Okay.
I don't know that Archie Griffin should have won 2 Heisman trophies.
He did, though.
He did with 2 Heisman, and he was a great player. And I am looking at the numbers right now because I had an idea of what they were and then what his competition was in his final season in 1975. So we have to skew the numbers and put them into context because teams weren't passing the ball. So throw the quarterbacks out the door unless they ran for a bunch of yardage and their teams won. They never won the Heisman. Running backs won the Heisman Trophy. Everybody ran the ball. I'm going to give you a guess, let you guess on how many touchdowns Archie Griffin scored in 1975.
So if I'm not mistaken, Pete
Johnson,
thank you. Actually,
Cincinnati Bengals.
Yeah.
Yep.
Again, another one of my very favorite people. I cannot believe I just blanked on his last name. He actually held the record for a while and around the same time period. So what was, you said how many touchdowns in that 75 season?
Yes.
10.
So this is the oddity here, is that you're right. Pete Johnson got the football inside. Well, no. I'm sorry. You're not right. Your number is not correct.
Okay.
You're right in your thinking.
Don't gas me up like that.
This is just an odd situation. So Archie Griffin's carrying the ball most of the time.
True. So he's got the yardage, but Pete has the scoring record.
Actually, this is odd. Archie Griffin carried the ball 262 times. Pete Johnson 227. It's not that much of a disparity.
No.
So they're basically splitting carries, and Archie Griffin averaged 5.5 yards per carry, and Pete Johnson 4.7. So to fill in where Claire was going with this is that Archie Griffin was the main back and he's carrying the ball. So on your typical 80-yard drive, he's running the ball most first and second downs and they're going down the field. Then Pete Johnson, and this isn't entirely true because the numbers are going to dispel this to a certain extent, but the narrative is basically that they get inside the 5-yard line. In comes Pete Johnson, who is basically a glorified like left tackle.
Lineman,
He was huge. And then he would run for all the touchdowns. This is amazing. Archie Griffin, I didn't know that it was this bad. I knew that it was something in this range. Archie Griffin ran for 4 touchdowns his senior year at Ohio State, and Pete Johnson ran for 25.
Wow.
25 touchdowns.
Oh my gosh.
And Pete Johnson.
And now so we're going to totally geek out.
And he ran for 1,000 yards, and Pete Johnson was nowhere in the Heisman balloting in the top 10.
So, all right, correct me if I'm wrong here too, about who broke that scoring record. Was it Mike Nugent?
Oh, the scoring record.
The scoring record.
Probably a kicker. Keith Byers scored a lot of touchdowns, but he didn't hit 25. He had the 84 season when he finished second to Doug Flutie in the Heisman balloting, and he scored a lot of touchdowns that year, but I don't think he scored 25.
I know a lot of people thought Keith Byers should have definitely won the Heisman that year, that it was stripped away by the Hail Mary of
exactly. He won the Heisman based on one play that was not, it was impressive. He threw the ball 50 yards, but he just threw the ball. And
yeah, right. There was no touch on it or aim. It just happened to be a spectacular ending.
And to me, I say this around that time of year, every year, to me, that's the most overrated play in the history of college football.
You're not going to get me to move on that either. I agree.
It wasn't a bowl game. It wasn't a championship game. It wasn't a rivalry game. Those teams had lost. Miami lost 5 games that year. They weren't that good. And it was just on Thanksgiving weekend. So a lot of people were watching football. And Doug Flutie was a bit of a, I'm going to avoid the word freak. You know what I mean? He was just a different type of player and he was fun to watch. And he was exciting. And Boston College was awful before that. And he lifted them to prominence. So, but we see Hail Marys like one like every other week in college football, or 2 a week, or whatever it is. We see a couple dozen every season that are roughly what we saw there. Yeah, just
wasn't. Yeah, no, I completely agree. Keith Byers and his shoeless run. Still, I think a lot of Ohio State fans, that's cemented in their memory too.
Yes, it is. He ran for 274 and 5 touchdowns against Illinois, losing 24-0 and coming back for the win. All right, Claire, trip down memory lane.
I'll do it anytime. I'm game.
I will too. I love it. Claire Crawford, The Ozone, and her podcast with Joe Dexter. Oh, hail no. Claire, it's always a fun discussion.
Always a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on.